Greetings, all. Continuing our conversation about Delisa, once again, I am impressed by the the depth of consideration um, of these very well presented cases and the extent to which you are absorbing the readings and applying the concepts in your analysis of the cases. With regard to Delisa, there was generally consensus that her anxiety is generated from projecting her own experiences onto her daughter. And as Tara points out, much of her understanding of those events seems to continue to be at the level of an 11-year-old girl. And her understanding and processing of the event doesn't appear to have evolved or changed. This is an important point. It's often true that a person's perspective related to trauma is frozen at the time that that trauma occurred, at the age the person was at the time that the trauma occurred. It's also, as Lisa points out, important to identify the meanings that Delisa attaches to her anxiety. Otherwise, the worker is likely to fill in the gaps with their imagination. There may well be cases in which it seems very obvious to you what is going on, and then you find out the perspective of the client and the meanings the client attaches to particular events, and you realize that it's very different from what you imagined. There's a recurring theme in your case conference. As Sherry puts it, if Delisa learns to separate her fears from related to her early experience from the reality of her daughter's situation, it will help her overcome her anxiety. And that is true. Some therapists refer to this as, quote, looking at your watch, understanding the circumstances and the conditions that were present when a traumatic event occurred, and then examining those in juxtaposition to the current circumstances. As Chela points out, as human beings, we're always evolving and changing, and with that comes a process of letting go, which often includes feelings of loss and grief. And that is certainly applicable in this case, in which Delisa experienced in different ways losing both parents. And so, as with many situations, grief work is certainly appropriate here. Several of you discussed the importance of normalizing her experience. Many people have problems with anxiety related to separating from their children when they first drop their children off at a daycare. And it's important to normalize this experience. As Hannah points out, especially in situations as with Delisa's father, when the anxiety is related to a disappearance of a loved one, the ambiguity there is all the more anxiety-provoking. Sherry and Ryan point out the benefit of being knowledgeable about the variety of therapeutic alternatives and then tailoring the intervention to the particular client and their particular needs. As Ryan points out, there's a concept that brief dynamic approaches in therapy focus on the person and variables such as systems and environment rather than historical genetic patterns. This makes me believe her therapy sessions might be less about why her father left and more centered on how Delisa managed her feelings and the sudden change in her life. William points out the importance of involving Derek in the solution. This is not an individual problem. This is, by definition, a family problem. Tara calls our attention to the central importance of rapport. As she says, I've found in my interactions one-on-one, counseling, or in therapy situations that I have the best therapeutic ideas and path and plan, but if I'm not clicking with a client, it means almost nothing. On the flip side, I've had situations where I am really connecting with the client and think I am all over the place with them and have no plan, and we're not getting anywhere. And then the client will come back and talk about something we worked on together that I have no recollection of. It is so important to create rapport and communicate a sense of admiration and respect for clients. You together presented a broad range of creative ideas for improving the daycare drop-off experience. Several of you described building morning rituals. And Juan points out it's also important to consider whether Delisa has that sense of separation anxiety when her husband departs. That's a very pertinent question, particularly given her background. In our live session in which I was voiceless, several of you posed the worry about how effective you as new workers will be in doing therapy. I'd like to submit to you that you now have a strong knowledge base, and the key component, the most important thing that you can do is secure good supervision on site. It is often more important to have supervision secured with someone who you trust and with whom you make a connection. It's almost more important to have that relationship than it is what you're actually doing, what area of work you're actually in. The supervision is that important. You also should not underestimate and should very much appreciate the power of peer supervision. And you have been engaging all semester in peer supervision. And as you can see, you together bring so much texture and richness to your understanding of each particular case. So these relationships that you are forging now are sustaining, and you should guard and nurture them and build new peer relationships so that you can engage in peer supervision throughout your careers. It's clear that in reading the chapter and in applying the different modalities to Delisa's situation, it's clear that you've deepened your understanding of the various approaches and integrated them with your own considerable lived and professional experiences. I want to end by just recapping some of the advantages of short-term therapy. Generally, in short-term therapy, most of the work takes place between sessions. And because clients are more active, they are also more empowered and feel more responsible for improvements that occur. The focus is more on their capabilities than their deficits. And since the work is more focused and has more specific goals, clients more clearly understand their difficulties, their reasons for their difficulties, and the changes that need to occur. And related to this, at the end of therapy, clients more clearly recognize what it is that they've achieved. This leads to a heightened sense of mastery and an increase in hope. A client might feel, since I have seen how I can make important changes in my life in a relatively short period of time, maybe it's possible for me to continue in this vein. Maybe it's possible for me to make other changes in other areas of my life. These advantages are common to brief therapies. Not to say that some of them don't occur with longer-term therapies, but they do tend to take place in the context of brief therapy. So once again, a very thoughtful and well-considered conversation, and I appreciate your input and the care with which you approach this challenge.